Those had yielded a profit almost double. The previous year, which was the third year, the peasants had maintained the same opposition to the arrangement, and the hay had been cut on the same system. This year the peasants were doing all the mowing for a third of the hay crop, and the village elder had come now to announce that the hay had been cut, and that, fearing rain, they had invited the estate clerk over, had divided the crop in his presence, and had raked together 11 stacks as the owner's share. From the vague answers to his question how much hay had been cut on the principal meadow, from the haste of the village elder to divide it without asking for permission, from the whole tone of the peasant, Levin perceived that there was something wrong in the division of the hay, and made up his mind to drive over himself to look into the matter. Arriving for dinner at the village, and leaving his horse at the cottage of an old friend of his, the husband of his brother's wet nurse, Levin went to see the old man at his apiary, wanting to find out from him the truth about the hay. Parmenich, a talkative, stately old man, gave Levin a very warm welcome, showed him all he was doing, told him everything about his bees and the swarms of that year, but gave vague and unwilling answers to Levin's inquiries about the mowing. This confirmed Levin still more in his suspicions. He went to the hayfields and examined the stacks. The haystacks couldn't possibly contain 50 wagon loads each, and to convict the peasants, Levin ordered the wagons that had carried the hay to be brought at once, to lift one stack and carry it into the barn. There turned out to be only 32 loads in the stack, in spite of the village elder's assertions about the compressibility of hay and its having settled down in the stacks, and his swearing that everything had been done in the fear of God. Levin stuck to his point that the hay had been divided without his orders, and that therefore he would not accept that hay as 50 loads to a stack. After a prolonged dispute, the matter was decided by the peasants taking these 11 stacks, counting them as 50 loads each. The arguments and the division of the haycocks lasted the whole afternoon. When the last of the hay had been divided, Levin, entrusting the superintendence of the rest to the clerk, sat down on a haycock marked off by a stake of willow, and looked admiringly at the meadow swarming with peasants. In front of him, in the bend of the river beyond the marsh, moved a bright-coloured line of peasant women, and the scattered hay was being rapidly formed into grey, winding rows over the pale green stubble. After the women came the men with pitchforks, and from the grey rows there were growing up broad, high, soft haycocks. To the left, carts were rumbling over the meadow that had already been cleared, and one after another the haycocks vanished, flung up in huge forkfuls, and in their place there were rising heavy cartloads of fragrant hay hanging over the horses' hindquarters. "What weather for haying! What hay it'll be!" said an old man squatting down beside Levin. "It's tea, not hay. It's like scattering grain to the ducks the way they pick it up," he added, pointing to the growing haycocks. "Since dinner time they've carried a good half of it. The last load, eh?" he shouted to a young peasant who drove by, standing in the front of an empty cart, shaking the cord reins. "The last, Dad," the lad shouted back, pulling in the horse, and smiling, he looked around at a bright, rosy-cheeked peasant girl who sat in the cart smiling too, and drove on. "Who's that, your son?" asked Levin. "My baby," said the old man with a tender smile. "What a fine fellow." "The boy's all right." "Married already?" "Yes, it's 2 years last St. Philip's fast." "Any children?" "Children, indeed. Why, for over a year he was as innocent as a babe himself, and bashful too," answered the old man. "Well, the hay, it's as fragrant as tea," he repeated, wishing to change the subject. Levin looked more attentively at Ivan Parmenov and his wife. They were loading a haycock onto the cart not far from him. Ivan Parmenov was standing on the cart, taking, laying in place, and stamping down the huge bundles of hay which his pretty young wife deftly handed up to him, at first in armfuls and then on the pitchfork. The young wife worked easily, merrily, and dexterously. The close-packed hay did not at once break away off her fork. First she gathered it together, stuck the fork into it, then with a rapid, supple movement leaned the whole weight of her body on it, and at once, with a bend of her back under the red belt, she drew herself up, and arching her full bosom under the white smock, with a smart turn, she swung the fork in her arms and flung the bundle of hay high onto the cart. Ivan, obviously doing his best to save her every minute of unnecessary labour, made haste, opening wide his arms to clutch the bundle and lay it in the cart. As she raked together what was left of the hay, the young wife shook off the bits of hay that had fallen on her neck, and straightening the red kerchief that had dropped forward over her white brow, not browned like her face by the sun, she crept under the cart to tie up the load. Ivan directed her how to fasten the cord to the crosspiece, and at something she said he laughed aloud. In the expressions of both faces was to be seen vigorous, young, freshly awakened love. Chapter 12. The load was tied on. Ivan jumped down and took the quiet, sleek horse by the bridle. The young wife flung the rake up on the load, and with a bold step, swinging her arms, she went to join the women who were forming a ring for the haymakers' dance. Ivan drove off to the road and fell into line with the other loaded carts. The peasant women, with their rakes on their shoulders, gay with bright flowers, and chattering with ringing, merry voices, walked behind the cart. One wild, untrained female voice broke into a song, and sang it alone through a verse, and then the same verse was taken up and repeated by 100 strong, healthy voices of all sorts, coarse and fine, singing in unison. The women, all singing, began to come close to Levin, and he felt as though a storm was swooping down upon him with a thunder of merriment. The storm swooped down, enveloped him and the haycock on which he was lying, and the other haycocks and the carts and the whole meadow and distant fields all seemed to be shaking and singing to the measures of this wild, merry song, with its shouts and whistles and clapping. Levin felt envious of this health and mirthfulness. He longed to take part in the expression of this joy of life, but he could do nothing, and had to lie and look on and listen. When the peasants with their singing had vanished out of sight and hearing, a weary feeling of despondency at his own isolation, his physical inactivity, his alienation from this world came over Levin. Some of the very peasants who had been most active in wrangling with him over the hay, some whom he had treated with contempt and who had tried to cheat him, those very peasants had greeted him cheerfully, and evidently had not, were incapable of having any feeling of rancour against him, any regret, any recollection even of having tried to deceive him. All that was drowned in a sea of merry common labour. God gave the day, God gave the strength, and the day and the strength were consecrated to labour, and that labour was its own reward. For whom the labour? What would be its fruits? These were idle considerations, beside the point. Often Levin had admired this life. Often he had a sense of envy of the men who led this life. But today, for the first time, especially under the influence of what he had seen in the attitude of Ivan Parmenov towards his young wife, the idea presented itself definitely to his mind that it was in his power to exchange the dreary, artificial, idle, and individualistic life he was leading for this laborious, pure, and delightful life. The old man who had been sitting beside him had long ago gone home. The people had all separated. Those who lived near had gone home, while those who came from far were gathered into a group for supper and to spend the night in the meadow. Levin, unobserved by the peasants, still lay on the haycock, and still looked on and listened and mused. The peasants who remained for the night in the meadow scarcely slept the whole short summer night. At first there was the sound of merry talk and laughter all together over the supper, then singing again and laughter. The whole long day of toil had left no trace in them but lightness of heart. Before the early dawn, all was hushed. Nothing was to be heard but the night sounds of the frogs that never ceased in the marsh, and the horses snorting in the mist that rose over the meadow before the morning. Rousing himself, Levin got up from the haycock, and looking at the stars, he saw that the night was over. Well, what am I going to do? How am I to do it? he said to himself, trying to express to himself all the thoughts and feelings he had passed through in that brief night. All the thoughts and feelings he had passed through fell into three separate trains of thought. One was the renunciation of his old life, of his utterly useless education. This renunciation gave him satisfaction and was easy and simple. Another series of thoughts and mental images related to the life he longed to live now. The simplicity, the purity, the sanity of this life he felt clearly, and he was convinced he would find in it the content, the peace, and the dignity of the lack of which he was so miserably conscious. But a third series of ideas turned upon the question of how to effect this transition from the old life to the new. And there nothing took clear shape for him. Have a wife, have work and the necessity of work, leave Pokrovskoye, buy land, become a member of a peasant community, marry a peasant girl. How am I to do it? He asked himself again, and couldn't find an answer. I haven't slept all night, though, and I can't think it out clearly, he said to himself. I'll work it out later. One thing's certain, this night has decided my fate. All my old dreams of married life were absurd, not the real thing, he told himself. It's all really so much simpler and better. How beautiful, he thought, looking at the strange mother-of-pearl shell of white, fleecy cloudlets resting right over his head in the middle of the sky. How exquisite it all is in this exquisite night. And when was there time for that cloud shell to form? Just now I looked at the sky and there was nothing in it, only two white streaks. Yes, and so imperceptibly too my views of life changed. He went out of the meadow and walked along the road toward the village. A slight wind arose, and the sky looked grey and sullen. The gloomy moment that usually precedes the dawn had come, the full triumph of light over darkness. Shrinking from the cold, Levin walked rapidly, looking at the ground. What's that? Someone coming, he thought, catching the tinkle of bells and lifting his head. 40 paces from him, a carriage with 4 horses harnessed abreast was driving toward him along the grassy road on which he was walking. The shaft horses were tilted against the shafts by the ruts, but the dexterous driver, sitting on the box, held the shaft over the ruts so that the wheels ran on the smooth part of the road. This was all Levin noticed, and without wondering who it could be, he gazed absently at the coach. In the coach was an old lady dozing in one corner, and at the window, evidently only just awake, sat a young girl holding in both hands the ribbons of a white cap. With a face full of light and thought, full of a subtle, complex inner life that was remote from Levin, she was gazing beyond him at the glow of the sunrise. At that very instant, when this apparition was vanishing, the truthful eyes glanced at him. She recognized him, and her face lighted up with amazed delight. He couldn't be mistaken. There were no other eyes like those in the world. There was only one creature in the world who could concentrate for him all the brightness and meaning of life. It was she. It was Kitty. He understood that she was driving to Yugoslavia from the railway station, and everything that had been stirring Levin during that sleepless night, all the resolutions he had made, all vanished at once. He recalled with horror his dreams of marrying a peasant girl. Only there, in the carriage that had crossed over to the other side of the road and was rapidly disappearing, only there could he find the solution to the riddle of his life, which had weighed so agonizingly upon him of late. She didn't look out again. The sound of the carriage springs was no longer audible. The bells could scarcely be heard. The barking of dogs indicated that the carriage had reached the village, and all that was left were the empty fields all around, the village in front, and he himself isolated and apart from it all, wandering lonely along the deserted road. He glanced at the sky, expecting to find there the cloud shell he had been admiring and taking as the symbol of the ideas and feelings of that night. There was nothing in the sky in the least like a shell. There, in the remote heights above, a mysterious change had been accomplished. There was no trace of a shell, and there was, stretched over fully half the sky, an even cover of tiny and ever tinier cloudlets. The sky had grown blue and bright, and with the same softness, but with the same remoteness it met his questioning gaze. No, he said to himself, however good that life of simplicity and toil may be, I cannot go back to it. I love her. Chapter 13. None but those who were most intimate with Alexey Alexandrovich Karenin knew that while on the surface the coldest and most reasonable of men, he had one weakness, quite opposed to the general trend of his character. Alexey Alexandrovich couldn't hear or see a